So, good evening, everyone. How's everyone today? Everyone's good? Excellent. You're not lying to me, are you? If you weren't good, you'd say. I'm sure. Anyway, okay, so it's very good to be back here again and to see you all to continue our exploration of Buddhism and mythology. And as I did last week, to begin with a story, then I would like to begin with a story this week as well. So this one we're going to be reading today is the Sungsumara Jātaka, Jātaka number 208. And this is a very, very well-known story. In fact, one of the best-known of the Jātaka stories. We'll have a bit of a look at that later. In fact, I'd be surprised if you haven't heard this in one form or another at some point. Once upon a time, while Brahmadatta was the king of Benares, the Bodhisattva came to life at the foot of the Himalayas as a monkey. He grew strong and sturdy, big of frame, well-to-do, and lived by a curve of the river Ganges in a forest haunt. Now at that time there was a crocodile dwelling in the Ganges. The crocodile's mate saw the great frame of the monkey, and she conceived a longing for his heart to eat. So she said to her lord, "Sir, I desire to eat the heart of that great king of the monkeys." "Good wife," said the crocodile, "I live in the water and he lives on dry land. How can we catch him?" "By hook or by crook," she replied. "Caught he must be. If I don't get him, I shall die." "All right," answered the crocodile, consoling her. "Don't trouble yourself. I have a plan. I will give you his heart to eat." So when the Bodhisattva was sitting at the banks of the Ganges after taking a drink of water, the crocodile drew near and said, "Sir Monkey, why do you live on bad fruits in this old familiar place? On the other side of the Ganges there is no end to the mango trees and the labuja trees, with fruit as sweet as honey. Is it not better to cross over and have all kinds of wild fruit to eat?" "Lord Crocodile," the monkey said, "deep and wide is the Ganges. How shall I get across?" "Oh, if you go, I'll mount you on my back and carry you over." The monkey trusted him and agreed. "Come here then," said the other, "up on my back with you," and up the monkey climbed. But when the crocodile had swum a little way, he plunged the monkey under the water. "Good friend, you're letting me sink," cried the monkey. "What's that for?" Said the crocodile, "You think I'm carrying you out of pure good nature? Ha! Not a bit of it. My wife has a longing for your heart, and I want to give it her to eat." "Friend," said the monkey, "it is nice of you to tell me. Why, if our heart were inside us when we go jumping among the treetops, it would be knocked all to pieces." "Well, where do you keep it?" The Bodhisattva pointed to a fig tree with clusters of ripe fruit standing not far off. "See," he said, "there are our hearts hanging on the fig tree." "Well, if you show me your heart," said the crocodile, "then I won't kill you. Take me to the tree then, and I'll point it out to you hanging upon it." The crocodile brought him to the place. The monkey leapt off his back, climbing up the fig tree, sat upon it. "Oh, silly crocodile," he said, "you thought there were creatures that kept their hearts in a treetop. You're a fool, and I've outwitted you. Keep the fruit to yourself. Your body is big, but you have no sense." And to explain this idea, he uttered the following verses. "Rose apple, jackfruit, mangoes too, across the water there I see. Enough of them, I want them not. My fig is good enough for me. Great is your body, verily, but how much smaller is your wit. Now go your ways, Sir Crocodile, for I have had the best of it." These translations were done in the 19th century. I don't think anyone's tried to rhyme Pali verses since then, but they didn't do too bad a job. The crocodile, feeling as sad and miserable as if he had lost 1,000 pieces of money, went back sorrowing to the place where he lived. When the master had ended this discourse, he identified the birth. In those days, Devadatta was the crocodile, the lady Chincha was his mate, and I was the monkey. Okay, now there's a little bit here below here which really shouldn't be there, and actually this should have been edited out. Unfortunately, who's in charge of this stuff? I don't know. Oh, hang on, that's me. And I will probably delete it when I get back if I get the chance. This is kind of left there as just a note or comment by the translator who's heard of this other story. But it's kind of a quirky little detail. And so he's just relating another version of the story. It's a similar version of the story, but interesting that he heard it from Russia, right, by a friend of his who heard it from his nurse, right? So it's the nurse, i.e. the women in the household, who are passing down the story in Russia. And then that's where it gets to made its way to the Western scholars. So the story of the crocodile and the monkey. Now, I'll just say a few details about this before we go on. Now, notice, I think if you were here last week, you'll notice that there are certain similarities, or certain patterns that we're seeing recurring between this story and the story that we heard last week. Right? They're actually very like it's almost like a different version of the same story. Right? It begins with the wife's desire. She wants something. It's even the same thing, really. I mean, there's a whole idea of mangoes as an object of desire is still there, but so she wants to eat the heart of the monkey. So it's still that same thing. The wife's desire is what sets the story in motion. And then there's the quest. The husband takes on the quest to try to achieve the thing. In this story, of course, he doesn't achieve his quest, right? He fails. But the story is a story of the triumph of intelligence, right? This is what the point of the story is. And if we look at the history of mythology, the older mythology, we tend to see that the heroes are like big tough guys with swords who chop people's heads off. That's the old heroes. And the more modern heroes, as we come towards the axial age, I mentioned last year, 500 BCE, remember this age? One of the defining points of that is that it's no longer brawn, which is the defining factor of the hero, it's brains. And we see this progression in Greek mythology very strongly. In the Iliad, the oldest of the Greek myths, the tough guys, Achilles and this mob, these are the ones who are the champions. Right? But the key that broke that whole story wasn't strength of brawn, it was a trick. Wily Ulysses comes up with this idea. How about we build a big wooden horse and we can hide in that? Yeah? So it becomes about cunning. And then when it moves to the Odyssey, the next great Greek myth, the focus shifts from deeds of physical heroism to intelligence and cunning and cleverness as being the defining characteristic of the hero. And this is what we also saw in the story last week. Remember the story last week? The outcast, although the one that you would expect to not have the learning, right? He is the one who ends up schooling the king and the Brahmin and bringing them to a higher level of wisdom. But also notice what's really nice about these stories when you start to notice these similarities. It's not just that they have similar themes, but that those similar themes are all echoed on a very fitting and appropriate level. See, the story we're dealing with now is a very small story, right? It's a story of a couple of animals. And so the desire is for something small. The trick is something small and simple, right? It's a kind of low-level cunning that's being celebrated here. In the story we heard last week of the outcast who wins the title of the Night King, it wasn't through cunning, right, but through bravery and intelligence. The knowledge that was being passed down was the knowledge of how to run a kingdom, statecraft, and it's a higher level of intelligence. And that story involves humans, right? You see the difference is there's this aesthetic unity, the choice of characters, the scope of the quest, the nature of how that transcendence happens is different at each stage, and yet the basic pattern of the story is the same. Well, it's very, very interesting. We actually heard this similar idea speaking with just the other day with Fran Bodkin and also in Central Australia about the Aboriginal myths. It's the same idea that you teach the same story, and then as you go on, you hear the same story again and again, but in more detail and more depth, and you're always seeing more to it. So this in a slightly different way, this is how this mythology works. That the same story comes again and again, but at different levels of depth. And the one we heard today is the kind of a very small one. It's a very, it's quite childlike, and it's like a fable. All right. So this particular story became renowned as one of the most popular teaching Jātakas stories, and it was included in the Hindu collection of stories called the Hindu, but modern Indian collection of stories, the Panchatantra, which the cartoons and so on of that have been extremely popular all through India. So like most Indian people, that's what they know. The stories and mythology that they know, whether Hindu or Buddhist or whatever, is what they've learnt from the Panchatantra and these comic books that have been going around. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a modern retelling of this story from an Indian perspective. So this is the same story.
Once upon a time, in a beautiful jungle, there was a lovely pond. In the pond, there lived a large yet gentle crocodile, in which lived a very smart monkey. The monkey and the crocodile were very good friends. Every day, the monkey would pluck some juicy apples for the crocodile and give them to him when he came to visit him in the morning. In the afternoon, the crocodile would swim to the center of the pond. And pick some plump fishes. And carry them back to the monkey. The two friends played together and talked for hours. One day, the crocodile met a lady crocodile. When the wife of the crocodile heard that her husband had a monkey for a friend, she felt greedy and wanted to eat the monkey. That night, before going to sleep,
My dear, how much do you love me?
Why do you ask? You know I love you very much.
Then you must fulfill one of my wishes.
What is it, my dear? I shall do anything for you.
You know how we ladies like to look beautiful.
Oh, my dear, but you are very beautiful.
You say that to flatter me. I have heard if one eats the heart of a monkey, one can become more beautiful than ever.
Oh, I see.
So now you must bring me the heart of a monkey.
Where can I get one?
What about that monkey who lives on the bank of our river?
Oh, but he's my friend.
Come now, you can't love him more than you love me. Invite him to lunch to our place, and I shall kill him and then eat his heart.
the crocodile became very sad and quiet.
Oh, husband, can't you even do so much for me?
He said,
Oh, my dear, I shall bring the monkey home tomorrow.
The next day, when the monkey met the crocodile, he noticed something was wrong.
What is the matter, my friend?
Nothing. Would you like to go for a ride?
Sure. Why are we going so far, my friend? You mentioned that other crocodiles are not as kind as you, and it may be dangerous for me.
I am sorry, my friend, but I promised my wife that I shall let her eat you. She wants to eat your heart and become beautiful.
Oh, why did you not tell me earlier then? I leave my heart in my tree with the apples. Yeah.
Really?
Yes, let's go back and get it. Then you can take it to your wife and make her happy.
The kind crocodile swam back to the tree. As the bank neared, the monkey jumped off the crocodile's back.
You were foolish not only to believe me, but also to agree to what your wife said.
Saying this, the monkey went into the jungle, leaving the sad crocodile behind.
So there you go. Well, there's a few changes made in that story, and I'm not 100% convinced that they're for the better. I mean, the message now is bros before hoes, right? I mean, that's the message. In that story of the story I mentioned before, where the Russian story was told by the nurse, and so it was passed down by the women within the family. This is a phenomenon that was discussed by Marina Warner in a beautiful book that she wrote, From the Beast to the Blonde, and she did a wonderful analysis of how this happened within the Western folk storytelling tradition, and how the stories that we know today, the Grimm's Brothers stories and Hans Christian Andersen and those kinds of things, were actually collected very often from women's storytelling and framed from a masculine point of view, where, of course, things change, right? And you can see actually in the original story, there's no kind of moral judgment about what the wife wants, right? It's a desire that she has, a primal desire that she has to have this monkey's heart. But the story just says that's what it is. And when it's told through that patriarchal lens, then it's needed to sexualize her, which, I mean, it's funny, right? But it's also kind of not funny, because this is the message which is being given to the kids, right? This is what the kids are being told. The message is now, don't do what your wife asks you to do, right? Because she's just motivated by vanity and she's going to use her womanly wiles against you, right? Which is actually the opposite of the message which comes from the deeper myths or the older myths. Now, we'll come back to this again. So my point here is that when we're reading these stories, it's very easy to change one or two details in the story, to change a different point of view, change a little bit of a perspective here and there, and then get something which is quite different out of it. The moral of the story which is drawn is quite different. Remember what I said last week? I was talking about this, and I was saying that the moral of the story, in a sense, isn't the point. When we're talking about deep mythology or old mythology, morals is something which comes later. Another way of putting this is to say that mythology is not about a should, it's about an is. It's about life. It's about the fact that we are here, and it's about the wonder and the excitement and the joy and the loss and the sorrow and all of those things which come because we are here and we were born, and this is what happens in our life. And so mythology is a way of helping us to participate in and to empathize with that process through telling stories. The moral of the story is added by the perspective of the storyteller. Now, last week we did a quite broad survey of the field of mythology. We studied many different areas and looked at many different areas, and I tried to give you some interpretive frameworks to understand myth and to give us some kind of entrance point to understanding how it all works. What I'd like to do for today's lesson is to look a bit more closely at some specific stories, especially those found in the Pali Jātaka collection. And we will be hopefully seeing how some of those themes and ideas that we talked about last week are reflected and drawn out and exemplified in these particular stories. But we won't be looking just at the Jātakas, because I also want to look at how the Jātaka stories relate to the storytelling that we find in the suttas themselves. So this idea that I mentioned last week, that we never hear these stories once. Actually, the stories are told so many times with different pieces of them in different places. And so sometimes we need to hunt around a bit to sort of pull the details of the story together and get a richer picture of it. So first of all, I'd like to give a little bit of an introduction to what the Jātakas actually are. Okay, first thing is that the Jātaka stories are essentially the past life stories of the Buddha. And remember, from what I said last week, study mythology is not the study of whether it's true or not. So don't ask, are these real past life stories or not? It doesn't matter. The point is that they have a meaning, and that they're seen within a community as having that meaning. The study whether they're real past life stories or not is a study for a history of Buddhism class. This is a study of mythology. The point is that these stories were passed down within the Buddhist tradition through some kind of meaning. Having said which, they're not really the Buddha's past lives. Okay. The best known of the Jātaka stories is the Pali collection, which contains over 500 stories. It's a bit hard to count them exactly because they sometimes repeat each other and so on. There are hundreds more Jātaka stories found in other Buddhist traditions. And Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, all of the Buddhist traditions have Jātaka stories. There are a few Jātakas which are contained within what we call the suttas, contained within the early four Nikayas. So these are the ones that are directly attributed to the Buddha himself. There's maybe a dozen or so Jātakas like that, probably less. And new Jātakas, like the Pali, what we call the Jātaka collection, a particular set of stories, is not the end of it by any means, and that new Jātakas were composed for the hundreds, if not thousands of years, and included in other collections. Now, what we call a Jātaka story has a typical structure, and so this is the basic fourfold structure of any Jātaka. First part of it is the introduction in the present. So the present here means during the life of the Buddha. Okay, so the Buddha reflects on some particular event that happens around him, and then says this is not the first time that this kind of thing has happened, and then he tells a story, and that story is the Jātaka story. All right. Then he tells the story mostly in prose. But the Jātaka story always contains a verse in which we find the highlight of the story. And we saw that in that story with the crocodile, that most of the story was prose, and that there's a few verses which give the highlight of it. In some cases, the verses are quite extensive, but usually it's just a few verses to highlight the main point of the story. Technically speaking, the prose portion of the Jātakas in Pali is in fact commentary, and the canonical text is just the verse. This is a characteristic of the Indian literary tradition, whereby the kernel or the chief idea was memorized and passed down verbatim, and the commentaries and background to that was more loosely passed down and explained by the teachers. So it doesn't mean that all of the stories were simply invented ad hoc at a later date. What it means is that the verse encapsulates the story, and that storytellers told it a bit more loosely, and that at some later on it was preserved in the form that we have it today in the Pali text. Right? But in many cases you can see that the story must have existed from the beginning of the verse. Finally, the last part of any proper Jātaka story, what makes it a Jātaka story, is the identification of characters. So this is when the Buddha, as the storyteller, will say, well, in that I was so-and-so, so in that one he was the monkey. Usually the enemy was Devadatta, the wife would be Maya in this life, the mother would be, the wife would be Yashodhara, the mother would be Maya, and so on. So the student would be Ananda, and so on and so forth. So that the characters in the Jātaka story are identified with the parallel characters in the Buddha's day. Okay? Now this is interesting, and it's interesting because it shows something about the perceptions of the Buddhist community about who these people were and what kind of role that they were playing within the Buddhist dispensation. Okay, now I won't go into that too much, but just to sort of note that this is how the Jātakas are structured. In terms of content, Thomas Rhys-Davids, the great Indologist, said that Jātakas are the most reliable, the most complete, and the most ancient collection of folklore now extant in any literature in the world. And his wife, Carolyn Rhys-Davids, went further and called the Jātakas collectively the greatest epic in literature of the ascent of man. These are quite strong claims, right? These are quite strong claims. And I think within the Buddhist tradition, we rarely recognize the importance of these collections. I think within traditional Buddhism, we tend to, yes, Jātaka stories are told and they're often remembered and so on, but they're often, they're told for children and these kinds of things. And we don't really recognize the significance that they have within world literature. And in modernist Buddhism and secularist Buddhism, you find that these things often get very much dismissed. Oh, it's just a story, it's just a myth, there's no point in even listening to it. And yet surely this is something which should cause us to pause, right? Right? Cause us to pause and to think about this. We have in the Buddhist collection, and this praise is only talking about the Pali collection, I mean, let alone the hundreds of other Jātakas and hundreds of other stories that aren't even Jātakas, right? There's plenty of other stories that aren't Jātakas. And that storytelling collection passed down within the Buddhist tradition from a very early time. Surely there's something significant in that, in the fact that the Buddhist tradition felt the need to collect these stories, to preserve them and to pass them down. When we look at the Jātaka stories, then don't forget that we're looking at something which is giving us a very, very detailed and very powerful reflection of the storytelling culture and society from which they came. Now, the Jātakas, in terms of their conscious positioning, come before the life of the Buddha. Okay, so the chronology is, people say, oh, the Jātakas early or late, but it's complicated, right? I mean, if the life of the Buddha is here, the Jātakas tell the story about, well, what happened before that, right? Their past lives. So they're actually situated before the Buddha, so before, say, 500 BCE. But the Jātaka collections, of course, are later, and things are added to them. I mean, we saw that even with the video one, right? The stories are elaborated, details are added, and these kinds of things, right? So stories are added and elaborated. So partly they're later than the Buddha, partly they're probably from the time of the Buddha, and partly they're earlier. And this is one of the very interesting things about the Jātakas, is that they very frequently preserve elements of culture and time and place that no longer existed even in the Buddha's day. This is extremely common in the Jātakas. One of the most obvious examples would be that in the Jātakas, the standard scenario is that while Brahmadatta was the king in Benares, yeah, there's the introduction of countless Jātaka stories. While Brahmadatta was king of Benares, and so on and so on, that's when the story starts. But by the time of the Buddha, Benares was no longer a kingdom. Benares had been conquered by Mahakosala, the grandfather of King Pasenadi, about 50 or 100 years before the life of the Buddha. So any stories that depict Benares as a kingdom must date from before that time. And so there are countless examples of cultural and historical details that situate the Jātakas in a time and a place before the Buddha, which of course makes it very fascinating, because it means that we can learn about those times and those places and how that they thought and how that they conveyed their ideas. And this point that Carolyn Rhys Davids is making is also very, very important, because this is not just a random collection of stories. Right? By putting each of these stories into the life of the Buddha, right? The hero of each of these stories is the Bodhisattva. So each of these stories becomes a chapter in the life of the Buddha, and each of them becomes a lesson that the Buddha learns on his way to awakening. Yeah? And there's something very powerful about that, isn't it? Right? Just to think about how through our experiences of life that we're just learning these lessons, and we're learning these decisions and these judgments and these episodes and all of these things over this life. We can see that, maybe over past lives as well. And we're learning this countless lessons, getting a bit of wisdom every time. And so we begin to sort of get some idea of the scope of what they were doing, right? We had the life of the Buddha, we have the suttas, the teachings of the Buddha, and then the Jātaka stories that are telling that kind of story of the deep past. And we're actually ending up with this huge story, that, you know, a massive myth of the life of the Buddha. The greatest epic in literature of the ascent of man. Now, we're talking about the Jātakas. So just again, so that we're clear, normally when we talk about the Jātakas, we're talking about a specific set of books within the Pali Canon. And within the Pali Canon, these belong to what we would consider to be the later portion of the Pali Canon. Okay, so that's the Jātaka collection. The earlier portion of the Pali Canon is mostly contained within the four Nikayas. And in those four Nikayas, there are a few Jātaka stories as well. All right? Now, actually within the four Nikayas, curiously enough, there's not much narrative. Mostly there's some background stories, some morality fables, and very rarely we find some traces of old myth. And this is something which I think is quite curious, and I don't know that anybody has really looked into it. Why did the Buddha tell so few stories? I mean, it's interesting. I mean, yes, of course there are stories there. There's parables, there's similes. There's a lot of similes, but there's not much in terms of long stories within the suttas. But, of course, the Buddhist tradition didn't have any such compunction, and then they added, thousands of stories on later on. So it's kind of interesting to imagine whether that reflects the Buddha's personality. Yeah, perhaps he was just a person who was more comfortable just dealing with straight, psychology and philosophy and so on, wasn't so much into storytelling. Maybe. Anyway, but it's just interesting to note that. Okay, so let's have a look at another story. Meeting Goblins on a Journey, a morality fable. And what we're going to do here is we're going to distinguish between a morality fable and a myth. And that's not to say that these things are absolutely distinguished. Like when we looked at the crocodile story, it actually had elements of old myth in it, but also was depicted as a morality fable. Right? And I don't want to convey the impression that the Jātakas are all about mythology, right? I mean, they all are about mythology in the sense that they're included within that story of the life of the Buddha, yes. But within themselves, they tell a wide variety of different kinds of stories. And only a relatively small proportion is what I would consider to be interesting from a mythic point of view. And so we're going to have a look at some of the other stories just to give you an idea of what is not a mythic story in that sense of that old myth. And here is a story which is originally told in the Digha Nikaya, the Payasi Sutta. In the Payasi Sutta, it's not a Jātaka, it's just a story that's told in the sutta, but it's taken up later and it's made into a Jātaka story. So it becomes the first of the Jātaka stories, a Pandaka Jātaka, and of course elaborated in quite a lot of detail. And the foe in the story is depicted as being black with red eyes. So he probably looks a little bit like that charming gentleman there. So let's just see this story in the earliest version. What is that? Digha Nikaya 23. Okay, so this story, to give a bit of background, Payasi Sutta in the Digha Nikaya is a discussion between a monk called Kumara Kassapa and a prince called Payasi. It's the only sutta in Buddhism, interestingly enough, that has a parallel in the Jaina scriptures. And in this, Prince Payasi takes the role of the extreme skeptic. No matter what Kumara Kassapa says, he says he doesn't believe him. And he continually, talks about all the experiments that he does and tests that he does to disprove the idea that there's anything to this idea of rebirth or life after death. And Kumara Kassapa gives a whole range of stories and similes and so on to try to convince him. At the end of it, Payasi said, actually I was convinced right at the beginning, but I pretended that I wasn't just because I wanted to hear all of your arguments. So there's a conceit within deceit. Anyway, so here's the story of the two caravan leaders. Well then, chieftain, I'll give you a simile. For by means of a simile, so this is the voice of Kumara Kassapa, not the Buddha here. By means of a simile, some sensible people understand the meaning of what is said. Once upon a time, a large caravan of 1,000 wagons travelled from a country in the east to the west. Wherever they went, they quickly used up the grass, water, and the green foliage. Now that caravan had 2 leaders, each in charge of 500 wagons. They thought, this is a large caravan. Why don't we split it in 2 halves? So that's what they did. One caravan leader, having prepared much grass, wood, and water, started the caravan. After 2 or 3 days' journey, he saw a dark man with red eyes coming the other way in a donkey cart with muddy wheels. He was armoured with a quiver and wreathed with yellow lotus, his clothes and hair all wet. Seeing him, he said, Sir, where do you come from? From such and such a country. Where are you going? To the country named so-and-so. But has there been much rain in the desert up ahead? Indeed there has, sir. The paths are sprinkled with water, and there is much grass, wood, and water. Toss out your grass, wood, and water. Your wagons will move swiftly when lightly laden, so don't tire your draft teams. So the caravan leader addressed his drivers, told him what he'd done, and they decided to do that. But in the caravan's first campsite, they saw no grass, wood, or water, and in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th campsites, they saw no grass, wood, or water, and all fell to ruin and disaster, and the men and beasts in that caravan were all devoured by that non-human spirit. Only their bones remained. Now, when the 2nd caravan leader knew the 1st caravan was well underway, he got grass, wood, and water, started the caravan. After 2 or 3 days' journey, he too saw a dark man with red eyes coming the other way in a donkey cart with muddy wheels, armoured with a quiver and wreathed with yellow lotus, his clothes and hair all wet. I mean, he's kind of overdoing it a bit, but anyway, seeing him, and they went through the same conversation, but the caravan leader addressed his drivers, and he said to them, but this person is neither our friend nor relative. How can we proceed out of trust in him? We shouldn't toss out any grass, wood, or water, but continue with our goods laden as before. Yes, sir, the drivers replied, and they restarted the caravan. They didn't see any grass, wood, or water, but they did see, eventually, when the other caravan that had come to ruin. They saw the bones of the men and the beasts who'd been devoured by that non-human spirit. So the caravan leader addressed his drivers, "This caravan came to ruin, as happens when guided by a foolish caravan leader. Well then, sirs, tossed out any of our merchandise that's of little value and takes what's valuable from this caravan." And that's what they did. They crossed the desert safety, as happens when guided by an astute caravan leader. In the same way, chieftain, being foolish and incompetent, you will come to ruin, seeking the other world irrationally, like the first caravan leader. And those who think you're worth listening to and trusting will also come to ruin, like the drivers. Let go of this harmful misconception, chieftain. Let go of it. Don't create lasting harm and suffering for yourself. But Payasi says, "Even so, I won't let go. King Pasenadi knows my views, and so do foreign kings. I shall carry on with this view out of anger, contempt, and spite." At least he's honest about his motivations, right? So, okay, so this is that story, and that story is told basically in the same way as a Jātaka. You see, there's no identification of it as a Jātaka here, but I won't go and look at the Jātaka itself because it'll take a little bit too long. But it's basically the same story, a few more details, and it identifies the Buddha with the wise caravan leader, Devadatta with the foolish caravan leader, and so on, as you'd expect. Now, a particular story is a good example of a morality fable. And, notice that it does have, in some way it reflects the culture of the times, right? That traveling across the desert to trade was a dangerous thing. And what's the interesting subtext of this, actually, is about how Buddhism was spread. Because the first story in the Jātakas is about how trade routes went, and that's how Buddhism was spread. Buddhism was spread by the caravans along the trade routes. So this is like a subtext as to the story of telling the story of how stories were spread. Oops, sorry about that. Here we go. And these are some of the characteristics of a fable, as we can see in that story. Okay. First of all, a nice clear structure. All right. I mean, everything's nice and black and white, right? You have this problem, you have the division between the two things, you have one's foolish, one's wise. Everything works itself out in the end. Yeah? There's a nice black and white morality to it, right? You draw a clear, straightforward lesson. You say this was right and this was wrong. And the purpose of a fable is to close off meaning, right? It wants you to take away one particular interpretation of it. Right? There's a right reading of that story. It's not to say that's the only meaning of it, but clearly the author is intending you to take away a clear moral from that story. Right? So these are some of the characteristics of a fable. And next we'll go on to have a look at a mythic fragment, and we'll see that that is actually quite different in those respects. And so this mythic fragment we're going to be looking at again from the suttas. This is from Digha Nikaya number 3. And this is a sutta called the Ambatta Sutta. Ambatta Sutta is a typical dialogue from the Digha Nikaya that deals with a dialogue between the Buddha and some Brahmins, and particularly with this very precocious Brahmin student called Ambatta. And one of the things that the Buddha had to deal with in his time was the fact that the Brahmins were kind of, or at least were seen to be quite, sometimes, not all, far from all, because there were many different attitudes, but sometimes they were quite conceited and quite proud. And so the Buddha had to find ways of negotiating with that pride. And so this is a story that's found in the Digha Nikaya number 3 to deal with this particular problem. I won't go through the whole. It's a long sutta. I won't go through the whole of it. So Ambatta, after being quite rude and quite dismissive to the Buddha because the Buddha's perceived low, caste compared to Ambatta, so the Buddha asks Ambatta his clan, which is a Kanhayana clan, and then tells the story of the origin of that clan. Once upon a time, King Okaka, wishing to divert the royal succession to the son of his most beloved queen, banished the elder princes from the realm, Okakamuka, Karakanda, Hatinika, and Sinisura. So this, right from the start, is quite an important kind of mythic theme, right? That idea of that kind of banishment, exclusion from the realm. I was discussing with Deepika and Radha the other day, there's a similar idea for the founding mythology for Sri Lanka, and the royal lineage there was that the kings were banished from their realm. The banished from the realm, they made their home beside a lotus pond on the slopes of the Himalayas, where there was a large teak grove. For fear of diluting their lineage, they slept with their own sisters. Then King Okaka addressed his ministers and councillors. Where, sirs, have the princes settled now? Sire, there is a lotus pond on the slopes of the Himalayas by a large grove of Saka, the teak tree. They've settled there. For fear of diluting their lineage, they are sleeping with their own sisters, Saka being the word for own. Then Ambata, King Okaka was inspired to exclaim, the princes are indeed Sakyans. The princes are indeed the best Sakyans. From that day on, the Sakyans were recognized and he was their founder. Okay, so this is the story of how the Sakyan clan, the Buddhist clan, came to be called the Sakyans. Because they were staying by the teak trees and because they slept with their own sisters. And King Okaka was apparently delighted with this. Right. Okay. I should just mention just briefly that Okaka is one of the most famous or most renowned of the mythological founders of the royal lineages in India. Traditionally, in the lists of the heritage of royal lineage in India, it divides into a solar lineage and a lunar lineage, and the founder of the solar lineage was King Okaka. This is the Pali pronunciation. The Sanskrit pronunciation is Ikshvaku, and Ikshvaku is derived from the word for sugar or sugar cane. So perhaps originally King Okaka was associated with the introduction of sugar cultivation. Okay, so, and of course, as here we see here, Okaka, the founder of the Sakyan lineage, of course, is the ultimate ancestor of the Buddha himself. Right? So the Buddha claimed the lineage from King Okaka. Now, King Okaka had a female bondservant named Disa. She gave birth to a black boy. When he was born, black boy said, "Wash me, mum, bathe me, get this filth off of me. I'll be useful for you." Whereas these days, when people see goblins, they know them as goblins. In those days, they knew goblins as black boys. They said he spoke as soon as he was born. A black boy is born, a goblin is born. From that day on, so of course the word for black is kanha, right? Which you might know more familiarly from the Sanskrit form, Krishna. Yeah? And this may be the very first myth that mentions Krishna. It's hard to say whether it's the same deity as the deity worshipped in later Hinduism, but there's no earlier text, as far as I know, that mention Krishna. So from that day on, the Kanhayanas were recognized and he was their founder. And that's how, recollecting the ancient name and clan of your mother and father, the Sakyans were the children of the masters, while you're descended from the son of a female bondservant of the Sakyans. Burn. Right? So now, of course, there's a number of slightly problematic things going on here. It's a little bit racist. And notice how, when I've translated this, I've tried to... like sometimes black boy is a proper name, sometimes it isn't, and these kinds of things. This kind of ambiguity is in the text itself, and I've tried to capture this in the translation. Right? So there's something about, certainly about his blackness, and often or typically what this would represent would be the clash between the Indo-European people, who would have been the royal lineages and the upper class people, and the local either Dravidian or various kinds of Aboriginal tribal people and so on. And that kind of distinction where the slaves and bondservants were from the local tribes people, and therefore maybe had dark skin, whereas the Indo-European people, because they came into India from the north, they tended to have fairer skin. and so this is where sometimes you get those racial differences as well. But of course, apart from that slightly kind of dubious thing, then there's a whole problem of kind of sleeping with your sisters thing, which generally you don't sort of use that as a way of saying this is how proud we are of our lineage, right? Again, these are sort of classic signs of old myth, right? That royal families often would be quite incestuous, right? And this was the case in European royal families up until quite recently, right? So you know, there's a long kind of anthropological history of that, but this is kind of, you know, mentioned quite matter-of-factly that was happening there. But also notice the identification with the sacred tree, the teak tree. So if you're familiar with the area, the teak is the equivalent of the oak in Western mythology. Teak is a magnificent, proud hardwood. You know, it's termite resistant. It's the best wood for building, and it's a magnificent tree. So by identifying with the teak tree, we saw last week, we saw some stories of how trees are very commonly involved with mythology and so on. And so here the Sakyans are being identified with that through a series of puns. Whether the word Sakya is actually related to those words is dubious, but in any case, that's the story that's being told. Yeah. Hmm.
Anything in the culture of that state which would have forbidden it?
Oh yeah.
There was.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
So, but his profaning, he's profaning it as being good.
Yeah.
Is a matter of whim.
Not a matter of whim, a matter of a sign that this is a remnant of a very old myth, because it's so completely inappropriate in the culture. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of kind of other symbolism and so on that we could look into that. But I mean, historically, the arising of the incest taboo is associated with the creation of larger scale social structures. So essentially, when humans are living in small scale social structures, like, you know, tribes and extended families and so on, then they tend to have relations with people who are more closely related to them. So incest taboo arises as a way of driving connection through more distant connections with people, and thus forming bigger and bigger circles of connected and related people, and ultimately leading to the establishment of nations and kingdoms and these kinds of things. So that presence of that incest taboo in stories is an indication that it stems from a very early anthropological time, where that process of establishing kingdoms and clans and nations was in its infancy. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously other ways we could read that as well, but that's just an anthropological dimension of it. Right. Right. Yeah, hence the lack of moral clarity, right? Yeah. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but yes, you're quite right. Yeah. Okay. So after telling this story, the Brahmin student said to him, "Look, okay, you're being too hard on Ambatta. He's quite intelligent and so on." So then the Buddha, I won't go on for all of the details, but the Buddha tries to rehabilitate Ambatta by continuing the story and telling some more dimensions of it. Again, notice this kind of interesting sort of aspect of the mythology, right? You've heard one thing. Yes, that's the story. That's what happened. But you haven't heard the whole story, right? And if you come away from it just from that little bit, you get the wrong message. So the Buddha goes on, "Please don't put Ambatta down too much by calling him the son of a bondservant. That black boy, right, the founder of his lineage, he was an eminent sage, right? So even though previously we had that kind of connotation, oh, he's a black boy, he's a goblin, he's covered in filth, right? Now the Buddha is saying, oh, actually, he was an eminent sage. He went to a southern country and memorized the prime spell, Brahma mantra, okay? Brahma mantra, right? Very powerful name, the prime spell. he approached King Okaka and asked for the I don't know what that prime spell was really, but anyway, he memorized it. He approached King Okaka and asked for the hand of his daughter, Madarupi, which means Madarupi. What is Madarupi? Madarupi means sweetly formed, sweet shape, something like that. Anyway, the king said to him, "Who the hell is this son of a bondservant to ask for the hand of my daughter?" Angry and upset, he fastened a razor-tipped arrow, but he wasn't able to either shoot it or relax it. Then the kings and counselors approached the sage, Black Boy, and said, "Spare the king, sir, spare him. The king will be safe. But if he shoots the arrow downwards, there'll be an earthquake across the entire realm. Spare the king, sir, and spare the country. Both king and country will be safe. But if he shoots the arrow upwards, there'll be no rain in the entire realm for 7 years. Spare the king, sir, spare the country, and let there be rain. Both king and country will be safe, and the rain will fall. And if the king aims the arrow at the crown prince, he will be safe and untouched." So King Okaka aimed the arrow at the crown prince, and he was safe and untouched. And the king was terrified, shocked, and awestruck. Scared by the prime punishment, he gave the hand of his daughter Madarupi. Students, please don't put Ambata down too much by calling him the son of a bondservant. That Black Boy was an eminent sage. So here we have a very, very powerful kind of eruption of very kind of ancient mythic and ritual signs. If you hear that, if you're familiar with, the most obvious correlate to here, you may be familiar with the story of Balder and Loki in the Nordic myth. Yes, Balder and Loki, where they were taking turns shooting the arrows at Balder, and he wasn't going to be harmed because he had a spell put on him that he couldn't be harmed by anything. And they'd made a spell everywhere that nothing could harm him. But the goddess who put the spell had the last one of the day was the mistletoe. Oh, the mistletoe's too small. I won't even bother putting the spell on that because there's no way that spell can harm them. So all the other gods were taking turns shooting arrows at Balder and laughing when they bounced off. Until eventually, of course, Loki makes an arrow out of mistletoe. Poor old Balder. That's the end of him. So this kind of thing, it reflects a ritual. So this probably would be reflecting an actual ritual which was being done. You know, again, you think of what's the story, what's his name with the apple on the head and these kinds of things. The idea that the king's life was intrinsically connected with the safety of the land, with the falling of the rain, right? This is foundational in the very notion of royalty. And so it was normal that the king would be doing rituals that would ensure the safety, prosperity of the realm and the falling of the rain and all of these kinds of things. And notice also that notion of the substitute sacrifice, right? So they're pretending that they're going to kill the crown prince, but it's just a kind of game. We all know he's not going to actually be killed. Yeah? Again, a kind of a memory, an echo of darker days when human sacrifice may well have been performed. But now it's just a game and we know he's going to be kept safe. So all these are signs. All these are ideas which are very prominent in Fraser's Golden Bough, and they're all things which are very much reflective of those old myths and that memory, a cultural memory of practices and ideas which have been passed down for a long time. And so the Buddha is bringing these things up. And he then, of course, in the story, asks Ambata to confirm it, and Ambata confirms that this is the story as he's heard it. So this is an example. So I wanted to tell you these two stories. So the story of the Jātakas and encountering the Jātakas along the way. This is an example of what I would consider to be a morality fable. Clear cut, straightforward, black and white. It aims to tell you what's what. And this one is an example of a mythic, or the eruption of mythic ideas within the suttas, and some of the ways how to recognize it. It has an odd structure, right? It's sort of put in there in a way that kind of is a bit clunky. It doesn't quite, where is it coming up? It has an unclear morality, right? And the whole kind of moral sphere of that is so murky, right? That we have the incest motif, we have the threatening to kill the crown prince thing. We have the sage who's basically extorting a marriage, right? all of these kinds of things. It's not giving us what kind of moral are we supposed to draw away from that story, right? So one of the points of that story also, it's not giving us a clear-cut message, it's invoking a sense of wonder. When you look at something like that, you think, what the? Right? That's the point. Right? And so one of the things that I want to try to convey to you is that when you come across things like this and you see these kinds of stories, don't just dismiss them. Don't just rationalize them. Don't pretend, oh, this must fit in with my ideas in some way. The point of them is to sweep your ideas away and to bring you into a place where you say, I don't know what's going on. What could this be about? And that sense of wonder and curiosity is one of the main purposes of myth, because it's exposing us to an order of reality which is deeper and broader than what we're normally used to. And of course, the other way to recognize a myth is that there's many different kinds of mythic themes. And here I'm just repeating the list of themes that I mentioned last week from Fraser's The Golden Bough, and you can see so many of these motifs which are found just within that short story. The idea of a sacred king, the idea of royal and priestly taboos, the sacred power of trees, the divorce of the temporal from the spiritual, Kanha was the sage, sacred power of women's fertility, not really mentioned there, but that one's not there. The divine king is killed. So again, the threatening of the crown prince there, the idea of being stuck between heaven and earth. It's like that state of suspension that the king was in, where he couldn't shoot down, he couldn't shoot up, right? So this is that kind of stuck between those two realms. The external soul in plants, right? The sacred trees, the teak trees, were the totem of the Sakyan clan. The idea of a substitute sacrifice, right, with the crown prince, and the inversion of values, where the most despised son of a slave girl then becomes somebody who's fit to marry the princess. Right? So in that short story, there's just a few things. And this, I didn't even choose this list thinking of that story. Right? This is just the list I got from last week of some things that I thought, oh yeah, these are just a list of motifs from Fraser. And yet almost all of them are found within that one short little piece of story. Yeah? And so to me, this is something which is very, when you see these kinds of things, you recognize this affinity and you recognize this universality of these ideas. That the same kinds of stories with the same curious and weird and odd features are told so many times across so many places. And that invites us to wonder and invites us to be curious. What exactly is going on? What kind of meaning is being spoken of here? I've been going on for far too long this evening. I apologize for that. Let's have a break. Cup of tea. Stretch your legs. Come back. $21. Okay, welcome back everybody. Let us continue with the second half of the session for this evening. And in this second half, so far we've looked at the story of the crocodile and the monkey as an example of the Dohala story, the story of the inscrutable and unstoppable desire of a woman. Her desire, though apparently bizarre and irrational, which we saw in the story last week, when it succeeds, results in a transformation and a positive movement and shift in the world. This time we saw that her desire failed, not because of her, but because she relied on a crocodile and he was not smart enough to actually do it, right? So just think about these kinds of ideas, like these kind of the ways that gender is being depicted, the way that femininity is being depicted, but also the ways that masculinity is being depicted, right? Because in the patriarchal version of the story we saw in the cartoon, right, the blame is very firmly placed on the woman. She's the one who did something wrong. In the Jātakas story, really, the problem is that the toxic masculinity, if you will, represented by the crocodile, right? I mean, he's representing a kind of a lower, more base form of masculinity, right? Of pure physical strength and primal desires, as opposed to the wit and intelligence of the monkey. So these are the ways that transcendence and development and evolution are depicted within a mythic format, and we'll see more examples of this in the subsequent sessions as well. Now, for now, I want to look at after the crocodile and the monkey story, we then saw a few examples from Jātakas and from the suttas of some morality fables, the story of the crossing the desert and meeting the yaka or the monster, and the wise and the fool, how they responded to that. And then we saw the rather curious story in the Ambata Sutta of the origins of the Sakyan clan, and how this little snippet of what appears to be quite a deep ritual and myth comes into the suttas in that kind of context. And I just want to emphasize again, for those of you who may not be that familiar with the suttas, that's very rare. It's like extremely rare. In fact, I think it's maybe the only place where something like that happens, but it certainly is extremely rare. And so it's very to me, it's very interesting to see that kind of thing happening. Okay, for this one, we're going to be looking at another kind of story and another way in which story and mythological stories operate within the Buddhist texts. This particular story is distributed quite widely across a whole range of texts, and the starting point is Digha Nikaya 26, the Cakkavatti Sutta, which talks about the myth of the wheel-turning monarch and the arising of the future Buddha Maitreya at a far distant point in the future. Now, that sutta itself and all of the issues involved with it is, of course, a very rich text which deserves a full treatment, but here we're going to be just focusing on one very small and curious detail, a detail that, in my view, has been mistranslated in the past and which is very easy to overlook. That detail then takes us to a couple of verses of a monk in the Theragatha, found in the Khuddaka Nikaya. Those verses then take us to the stories, a couple of stories in the Jātakas. Well, to one story in the Jātaka, Mahapanada Jātaka, but then that Jātaka then refers us to another Jātaka for its fulfillment. But then that Jātaka is then based on an origin story which is found in the Vinaya. Right? So it's getting a little bit complicated, right? And so I don't expect you to necessarily sort of get all of the details of this, but the main point of telling this story is to look at the way that this storytelling is distributed and the way that it often relies on memory and association, that you could refer to someone's name and you kind of know, right? I mean, like in the West, we might refer to like King Midas or something like that, and you have the Midas touch, and everybody knows, or Midas touched things and they turn to gold, right? And so that kind of implicit knowledge or cultural knowledge which is found there. So let's have a look at the different details of this story. This is one, to be honest, I'm not sure whether anybody has actually noticed this. I just noticed it myself last year and followed through on the different connections, but I'm not sure if it's really been studied. So the first part we'll have a look at is in Digha Nikaya 26, Cakkavatti Sihanada Sutta, where the story is of Maitreya, the future Buddha, and Sankha, who is the great monarch who reigns during the time of Maitreya. Here on the right we see that image of Maitreya, and this is from the Greco-Bactrian style, about 200 CE, and Maitreya there has a very fine looking mustache, right? That's all I've got to say about that. Here's and now the story of Maitreya again is a vast story of great importance for the history of Buddhism, but in the suttas it only appears once. Maitreya is only mentioned once. Again, I won't go into the question of whether this is an authentic teaching of the Buddha or not, but just to look at the sutta as we have it. And here the story, and again the whole story is full of very interesting details, but I will only talk about a few little bits here. So it basically tells the story, goes into the future, and everything gets really bad, the whole world falls apart, you have a whole kind of apocalypse situation, and then things gradually start to be built up again. people began to undertake morality, and lifetimes and population increases until we reach a time of unparalleled prosperity in the future under the reign of King Sankar. Okay, and this is where we're going to begin the story. So the people of that age will live for 80,000 years. Now, I don't know, I mean, Google and these people have these immortality projects. Maybe they'll succeed, I don't know. Anyway, 80,000 years, so there will be just 3 afflictions: greed, starvation, and old age. India will be successful and prosperous, and so on. And there's a capital called Ketumati, and there a king called Sankar will arise, whose dominion reaches across the land. He will have over 1,000 sons who are valiant and heroic, crushing the armies of his enemies. After conquering this land girt by sea, and I'd have to say, as a proud Australian, when I was translating this, I couldn't resist. Okay, anyway. Many people told me that was a bad idea, but okay. Right. So this is that. So okay. So just in your head, so be clear about the setting, right? So this is the Buddha is telling this story. It's a whole kind of mythological process. The rising of society, the decline, fall of society, and then the rising of a new society long in the future. And it's important to notice that with these time frames the Buddha's talking about, I mean, there's lots of Metteyas around. I don't know if you've noticed, but you can find a few of them on Facebook and stuff like that. And there's quite a lot around. But actually, according to the mythic time frame in the sutta, it's certainly not for a very long time. Anyway, so here in that day, the time of King Sankar, then the Blessed One Maitreya arises, and then he's a Buddha who teaches, realizes the same truth that Gautama Buddha realized, and taught the Dhamma in the same way that Gautama taught, and has a Sangha which is even bigger than that of the Gautama. Okay, so then at that day, here comes the little detail that I'm interested in. Then King Sankar will have the sacrificial post that had been built by King Panada raised up. Now, we haven't met King Panada anywhere previously in this story, or anywhere else in the suttas. He's just mentioned, here's King Panada's here, and his sacrificial post. Who's King Panada? What's his sacrificial post? After staying there, he will give it away to ascetics, Brahmins, paupers, vagrants, travellers, and beggars. And then, having shaved off his hair and beard, dressed in ochre robes, he'll go forth from the lay life to homelessness in the Buddha Maitreya's presence. And then he will become an arahant. And then this is more or less the ending of the sutta. So it's, I mean, it's quite a curious little thing. Like, remember what I mentioned before about how one of the signs of mythology is that that things appear in odd ways in the narrative, right? I mean, the whole story has been built up, and we have the wheel-turning emperor and all of these kinds of things, and then suddenly, out of the blue, something about this sacrificial post and King Mahapanada. Very weird. So what exactly is going on here? Well, in previous translations, the word I've translated as sacrificial post, in previous translations was translated as palace. And I think that's clearly a mistake, and I'll show you why. The Pali word is yupa, and the normal meaning of yupa is a sacrificial post. What a sacrificial post is, I will show you in just a minute. But here we have another reference, the only other reference in the early canon to King Panada. Right? So this is in the Theragatha, one of the early collections of verses in the suttas. And so these are the verses associated with a monk called Bhaddaji. Now, we don't know very much about Bhaddaji, who was he and so on. We don't know why he told these verses. They're very curious verses. Most of the things in the Theragatha are not like this at all. But what does it say? There was a king named Panada who had a sacrificial post, all golden. Its height was 16 times its width, and the top was 1,000-fold. It had 1,000 panels and 100 ball caps, all adorned with banners and made of gold. There danced the fairies, numbering 7 times 6,000. I mean, it's a bit of an odd verse, right? What? Why is this? I mean, if you're familiar with the Theragatha, you know that this is like not at all like the kind of thing. I mean, here's a more typical Theragatha verse. You know, he's a monk, he's practicing mindfulness, he's recollecting his past lives, he's doing 7 factors of awakening. I mean, this is normal stuff. This is what you expect. As a monk, he's doing his meditation and getting the results of it, right? But then this Buddhaji comes along and you're like, what's going on with this? I have to say these particular verses are some of the hardest verses to translate in the whole of the Pali Canon. I struggled with these for days, and I was reasonably happy by the end, but there's a lot of very obscure terminology and references going on here. One of the things that helped me understand it was these coins. And I'm not sure if they're big enough here. They're probably okay. Oh, yeah, right. Okay, so you can see here, these are some coins. Now these are from, 335 CE, so maybe 800 years after the Buddha. Circular Brahmi legend. So the writing is Brahmi, and so on. So the front of the coin has the horse tied or connected with the yupa. Right? This is the yupa, this is the sacrificial post. So the sacrificial post is the literal post that the sacrificed animal is tied to. And here on the end, you can see this is the ball cap. Right? So in the thing it says it's adorned with 100 ball caps. So this is what it means here. Yeah. And it has streamers and so on coming off it. So decorations and streamers, and then a word and so on. This is the horse sacrifice, the most powerful sacrifice in Hindu ritual law. And the purpose of the horse sacrifice was to establish sovereignty by the king over the realm. And for those of you who don't know how it went, you didn't just get any old horse, tie it up to a post and then kill it. Oh no, that would be far too easy, okay? What you had to do is get a horse that fulfilled all of the different ritual requirements, right? And then you had to set it free. And then the king, with all the court and all the armies and so on, would follow behind the horse for a year. And wherever the horse went, that was your land. And if there happened to be another country, submit or die, right? And so this is what they did. So obviously you had to be a fairly confident king to do this. Now this is the queen. What's the queen doing here? Well, the queen plays a rather curious role in the horse sacrifice. And the role that the queen plays is... No, I shouldn't say. You sure? Here's another one. There's another coin. It's a similar one. You can see again the horse, the posts, the ball caps, the streamers, yeah, Brahmi script, and again the queen, and so on. Do you want to know what happened to the queen? You sure? He knows better, right? He knows me well enough. So what the queen's role in the sacrifice, at the end, when everything's happened, the horse is sacrificed, so you've got a dead horse lying there, a blanket is placed over the dead horse, the queen strips naked, gets under the blanket, and does the dirty with the dead horse. While... Sorry? What? How would you like to put it? I'm struggling. Yeah. And of course, yeah. And meanwhile, it's not just while she's doing that, but while she's doing it, everybody's around, and she's in fact engaging in this very bawdy conversation together with the Brahmin priest who's officiating at the thing, and they're sort of talking about the whole experience as they're going through it. Of course, there are different people will say that this is all symbolic and so on, and other people think that it really happened and so on. Either way, it's kind of outrageous, but you insisted. I mean, what can I say? Right? So again, when you start to sort of uncover these things, you find all these weird things about it, and you look at that and you think, that's so strange. But on the other hand, just you have to remember, these were human beings. These were people who did this. It were like people like us. I mean, if we happened to be born in that society, we would have probably said, hey, there's a horse sacrifice going on this afternoon. Let's go along for an afternoon's entertainment. It'll be great, right? And I mean, this is the way the kings were appointed. I don't know. The way that we appoint kings these days, is that any better? I'm not really sure. But anyway, the purpose was to establish the divine authority, right? So the stallion, of course, like a symbol of strength and masculinity and so on, but more specifically, the taming of the horse was the defining cultural achievement of the Indo-European people. Okay, so before they came to India in the Caucasian plains, 3000, 4000 BC, they tamed the horse and the war chariot. That's how they conquered all the lands all over the world. So the horse is a very powerful symbol of power and of authority and sovereignty. So they kind of did that, and then of course the queen simulating intercourse is like, well, this is how our lineage is going to keep the virility and the power of that noble beast who's already, you know, exercised his freedom. I mean, he's a bloke, right? So he can go wherever he likes and conquer any land, right? And so this is that kind of thing. So this is that horse sacrifice, and that's that post. So then just come back to this verse. That's what he's talking about. Right? I mean, he's clearly in these verses describing exactly that sacrificial post, the golden sacrificial post with the ball caps, with the banners and so on. Right? This is what he's describing. So when the yupa has been translated as palace, clearly it's not a palace; it's a sacrificial post. I mean, at a certain point, it probably became read as being a palace or interpreted in that way, but originally it meant a sacrificial post. Okay. But, okay, so that gives us a bit of background, but still kind of weird, right? I mean, what's Badaji's deal? Why is he talking about this, and what's the story going on? I mean, we assume that there must have been some background to this that we don't know about, right? I mean, there's obviously some reason why he spoke these verses or became associated with them and something, but all we have here is just these verses, and Badaji doesn't really appear much in other places in the suttas, so we don't really know too much about him. So to understand further about this, we have to turn to the Jātakas stories. And there's a couple of Jātakas, as I mentioned, that give us some details. Now, the Mahapanada Jātaka, remember that's the name of the king, Jātaka number 264, tells the story. Now, I won't go into all of the backgrounds here, but it simply says that Badaji was a sort of a wealthy, aristocratic young man, and the Buddha wanted to teach him, and so he went to teach him, and details and so on there. So they went past that place where King Panada was king, so this is where they got that association with it. The Buddha did various kinds of miracles and so on, and then the Buddha said that that Badaji had previously lived before in that place. Then we learn that in fact those verses were not necessarily the verses spoken by Badaji, because those verses are here repeated more or less there, but that Badaji was the actual King Panada. That's why he spoke those verses. All right? But it doesn't tell you much about King Panada and his life. All it says is that the rest of the story is told in the Suruchi birth. Right? So we've now gone from the Digha Nikaya to the Theragatha, from the Theragatha to the Jātakas, and from one Jātaka to another Jātaka. Okay? Luckily I got this already beforehand. So you see this kind of interconnectedness of it, right? And there's kind of multiple layers that's happening. Now, the Jātaka, the story of the past. Now remember the form of the Jātaka stories? I'll just come back to that briefly. So the structure of the Jātaka stories, we have to begin with the story of the present, right? So that's the story in the time of the Buddha, right? And so the story in the time of the Buddha begins here in the Suruchi with the story of Visakha. Now, many of you may be familiar with Visakha, was the most famous of the lay women disciples of the Buddha. And she once asked the Buddha for 8 boons, or 8 special privileges. And those 8 special privileges consisted of her being able to offer 8 kinds of things to the Sangha at the appropriate time. and the Buddha gave her that opportunity. And that story is told in the Vinaya, and here it's being retold in the Jātakas, of course, with more elaboration and fanciful details. Again, it's an interesting story, but I won't go into it too much because it will get too complicated. So the Buddha says that Visakha, not only in this life, has had many virtues, but also in past lives she has many virtues as well. And Visakha, in fact, is one of the a number of female disciples of the Buddha of whom were told very auspicious past lives. And this is one of those stories. So then he goes on to tell the story of the past. And again, here is the prose story of the past. And that is where we finally come to King Panada, but not yet. So once upon a time, there reigned a king Suruchi in Mithila. This king, having a son born to him, gave him the name of Suruchi Kumara, or Prince Splendid. When he grew up, he determined to study at Takasila, which is in modern-day Pakistan. So there he went and sat down at a hall in the city gate. Now the son of the king of Benares also, whose name was Prince Brahmadatta, went to the same place and took his seat on the same bench where Prince Suruchi sat. Remember I said earlier, King Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares. This is the classic time period of the Jātakas. They entered into converse together, became friends, and they both went together to the teacher, and they studied together. And becoming fast friends as students, they made the pledge, if I have a son and you a daughter, or if you have a son and I a daughter, we will make a match of it between them. And so this is a creation of alliances through those friendships that they made at university. Right? I mean, it still happens today, right? Okay. So, a son was born to King Suruchi, also called Prince Suruchi, and Brahmadatta had a daughter, and her name was Sumedha, the wise lady. Prince Suruchi in time grew up and went to Takasila for his education, finished and returned. So they decided to marry them together. But before they had come, the king of Benares asked his queen the question, "My lady, what is the worst misery for a woman?" I mean, it's a kind of loaded question. I mean, there's a whole kind of childbirth thing and all of these kinds of things. But worse than any of those, quarreling with her fellow wives. Right? Remembering in those days, and still up until quite recently, it was very often the custom that a husband would have many wives, especially if he was wealthy and powerful. Then, my lady, to save our only daughter, the Princess Sumedha, from this misery, we will give her to none but him who will have her and no other. Right? So it's establishing, like it's a culture story for the establishing of monogamous marriage. Then the ambassadors came and named the name of his daughter. I will only give one to who will wed her and no others. But the king, they sent back to the king of Mithila, that's Suruchi, and he said, "Ours is a great kingdom. The city of Mithila covers 7 leagues. The measure of the whole kingdom is 300 leagues. Such a king should have 16,000 women at the least." At least. All right, fair enough. But Prince Suruchi, hearing the great beauty of Sumedha, fell in love from hearing of it only. So he sent word to his parents, saying, "I will take her and no other. What do I want with a multitude of women? Let her be brought." They did not thwart his desire, but sent a rich present and made her his queen consort, and they lived together happily. However, though she dwelt in his palace for 10,000 years, they had neither son nor daughter. The townsfolk gathered together in the palace courtyard. "What is it?" the king asked. "Fault we have no other to find but this, that you have no son to keep your line. You have but one queen, yet a royal prince should have 16,000 at the least. Choose a company of women, my lord. Some worthy wife will bring you a son." I made my word, so he refused their request. Sumedha heard what was said. The king refuses to choose his concubines for his truth's sake. Right? So this idea of the truth and that integrity of that kind of moral commitment that he's made to his message, to his wife. He won't depart from that. "Well, I will find him someone." Playing the part of mother and wife to the king, she chose at her will 1,000 maidens of the warrior caste, 1,000 of the courtiers, 1,000 daughters of householders, 1,000 of all kinds of dancing girls, 4,000 in all, and delivered them to him. These dwelt in the palace for 10,000 years, and still they had no son or daughter. In this way she brought three times brought 4,000 maidens, thus 16,000 wives in all. 40,000 years went by. That's to say 50,000 in all, counting the 10,000 he lived with her alone. Right? So with 40,000 years, with 16,000 wives. I don't know. I mean, typically you'd think, well, maybe the problem's with the bloke rather than with the man. I don't know. I'm not a doctor, I can't say, but... So the king, my lord, pray for a son. Right, so they worshipped various kinds of deities, made various kinds of vows. No son appeared. Sumedha prayed for a son. Now it gets interesting. The king commanded Sumedha to pray for a son. She consented. On the fast day of the 15th day of the month, she took upon her the eightfold Sabbath vows and sat meditating upon the virtues in a magnificent room upon a pleasant couch. The others were in the park, vowing to do sacrifice with goats or kine. By the glory of Sumedha's virtue, Saka's dwelling place began to tremble. Okay, so notice the contrast here. All the other women were doing various praying to various deities, to sacrificing gods, but Sumedha, the wise one, the pure one, was meditating on the virtues, on the Dhamma. By power of her virtue, Saka's dwelling place began to tremble. Okay, so Saka, the Lord of Gods. His palace is now becoming unstable, because if she's too powerful and too virtuous, she can overthrow his throne. He pondered and understood that Sumedha prayed for a son. Well, she should have one. But I can't just give her this or that son. I will search for one who will be suitable. He saw a young god called Nalakara, the basket weaver. He was a being endowed with merit who in a former life in Benares when this befell him. So now is the story of the being who Saka is going to choose to be Sumedha's son. On his way through the fields, he perceived a Pacheka Buddha. He sent on his hinds, bidding them sow the seed, but himself turned back and led the Pacheka Buddha home and gave him to eat and conducted him again to the Ganges bank. He and his son together made a hut of trunks of fig trees for the foundation and reeds interwoven for the walls, a door he put to it and a path for walking. There for 3 months he made the Pacheka Buddha dwell. And after the rains were over, the two of them, father and son, put him on the 3 robes and let him go. In the same manner, they entertained 7 Pacheka Buddhas in that hut, gave them the 3 robes, and sent them on their ways. So one of the things that this is doing is it's saying that the custom of the Buddhist Sangha to spend 3 months in the rains retreat, this was a pre-Buddhist custom done by the sages of old. And so men still tell how those two, father and son, turned basket weavers and hunted for osiers, not sure what an osier is, on the banks of the Ganges, and whenever they spied a Pacheka Buddha, they did as they said. And when they died, they were born in the realm of the 33, and then Saka went to invite one of them to become the daughter of the prince of Sumedha and Suruchi. But he said, O king, the world of men is hateful and loathsome. They who dwell there do good and give alms longing for the world of the gods. What shall I do when I get there? I mean, fair enough, right? He's already in heaven. Why would he want to go back to earth? So you can enjoy in perfection all that can be enjoyed in that world. You should dwell in a palace made with stones of price, 75 leagues in height, do consent. Anyway, so when Saka received his promise in the guise of a sage, he descended to the king's park and showed himself soaring above those women to and fro in the air, and he chanted, "To whom shall I give the blessing of a son? Who craves the blessing of a son? To me, sir, to me." Thousands of hands were uplifted. And he said, "I give sons to the virtuous. What is your virtue? What your life and conversation?" They drew down their uplifted hands, saying, "If you would reward virtue, go seek Sumedha." So again, here we see that upturning of that moral order, the old moral order based on ritual and worship of deities and offerings being replaced by the order of virtue and living a good life. So he went to see Sumedha and asked her for her virtues. And then she then lists the verses of her own virtues. And so again, remember here the structure of the story, the highlights of the verse, the main point is in the verses. So she says, I am King Ruchi's consort queen, the first he ever wed, with Suruchi 10,000 years my wedded life have led. And I never demeaned him by word or deed. If this be true, O Holy One, so may that a son be given, but if my lips are speaking lies, then then burst my head in 7. And for all the fellow wives, then I never had any jealousy. For all the slaves, messengers, and so on, I always gave them food and treat them well with a cheerful, pleasant face. This is one of the characteristics and virtues of the household life, which is mentioned repeatedly in Buddhism, is a good treatment of workers and of those people who are working for you. This is mentioned many, many times throughout the suttas. Ascetics, Brahmins, anyone who's begging, I will give them dana, give them food and so on. And on the oppositors, I will keep the oppositors and practice the precepts. Okay, so then Saka says he will give her the prince. I won't go through all of it. Malakara was born, and at the end of 10 months he brought forth a son, and they gave him Mahapanada, his name. Okay, so we finally found out who Mahapanada is, right? We've come all that way from the Digha Nikaya, all the way through this story, and we found out who he is. But we haven't found the most interesting part of his story yet. The people of the 2 countries came along saying, My lord, we bring this for the boy's milk money, and each dropped a coin in the king's courtyard. A great heap there was of them. The king did not wish to accept this, but they would not take the money. So they said, when the boy grows up, my lord, it will pay for his keep. Again, this motif of the lords of the land voluntarily offering to pay funds, and then the king refusing and saying, I have enough, I don't need any more. This is again something which is repeated multiple times in the stories of Buddhist kingship. It's a recommendation for the virtues of a good ruler, right? Don't be too greedy. The king was brought up the lad was brought up amid great magnificence, and then when he came of age, 16, he was perfect in all accomplishments. The king said to the queen, My lady, when the time comes for the ceremonial sprinkling of our son, let us make him a fine palace for that occasion. And so then they built the place, and Saka asked the builder of the gods, Wisakama, to come and make the mansion for him. And they did at the same time 3 ceremonies: the ceremony for consecrating the palace, the ceremony for spreading above him the royal umbrella, and the ceremony of his marriage. Now, at the time of the ceremony, all the people of both countries gathered together and spent 7 years of feasting, nor did the king dismiss them. 7 years, right? They knew how to party in those days. Their clothes, their ornaments, their food, and their drink, all the rest of them provided by the royal family. At the end of 7 years, they began to grumble. They said, O king, why have been having reveling at this feast? 7 years have gone past. When will the feast come to an end? My good friends, all this while, my son has never once laughed. King Panada never once laughed. As soon as he laughs, we will disperse. Then the crowd went beating the drum and gathered the tumblers and jugglers together. Thousands of tumblers were gathered. They divided themselves into 7 bands and danced, but they could not make the prince laugh. As, of course, he that had seen the dancing of dancers divine could not care for dances such as these. Then came 2 clever jugglers, Bandukana and Bandukana, crop ear and yellow ear, and they say, we will make the prince laugh. Bandukana made a great mango tree. Here's a mango tree again. He called Sans Parallel, without parallel, I guess. Not sure what the Pali is there. Grow before the palace door. And then he threw up a ball of string and made it catch on a branch of the tree. Also an interesting motif. I mean, it doesn't look completely unlike that whole thing here, right? Like a sacred tree with the strings hanging off it. Anyway. And he climbed up into the mango sans pareo. Anyone know how to pronounce that? No. Now the mango sans pareo, they say, is Vesavana's mango, the divine mango. And the slaves of Vesavana took him as usual, chopped him up limb meal, and threw down the bits. Okay? So this is the fool, the court jester, is climbing up into the mango tree like the outcast did in our first story, right? The divine mango tree of the kings. But whereas the outcast managed to escape his fate, he didn't. They chopped him up into bits. Oh dear, that's no good. I don't know how that's going to make him laugh. The other jugglers joined the pieces together and poured water on them. The man donned upper and undergarments of flowers and rose up and began dancing again. Hilarious, right? Even the sight of this did not make the prince laugh. I mean, can you imagine watching a man being chopped into pieces in front of you and then magically resurrected? Then Pandukana had some firewood piled in the courtyard and went into the fire with his troop. When the fire was burnt out, the people sprinkled the pile with water. Pandukana with his troop rose up dancing with upper and under garments of flowers. And people found they could not make him laugh. They grew angry. Saka, perceiving this, sent down a divine dancer, bidding him to make Prince Panada laugh. Then he came. He remained poised in the air above the royal courtyard, not to touch the sky, the earth, not to see the sky, between one and the other, and performed what is called the half-body dance. One hand, one foot, one eye, one tooth go a-dancing, throbbing, flickering to and fro, while the rest stone still. Mahapanada, when he saw this, gave a little smile. But the crowd roared and roared with laughter. They could not cease laughing. They laughed themselves out of their wits. They lost control of their limbs. They rolled over and over in the royal courtyard. That was the end of the festival. Right. So that's the coronation of King Mahapanada. 7 years of partying. And at the end of 7 years, it's one little bit of a smile. That's all. Okay, so again, we can draw in so many of these mythic ideas that we've encountered again and again. The sacred tree, sacred mango tree, with the turning upside down of all values, the suspension between heaven and earth, the way that the divine powers are involved in establishing the authority of kingship, and so on and so forth. But one of the details here that we shouldn't neglect is the detail that all of this was only made possible because of Sameda and because of Sameda's wish. Again, come back to that theme of the dohala, the wife's wish, the wife's yearning. Now, normally, when this is depicted in classical myth or in old myth, this is an irrational whim that she has, an idea, a fancy that she has, that she must have something and it must be accomplished. Here, it's a modernized version of this myth. It's a very Buddhist version of this. Right? The Jātakas aren't always very Buddhist, right? Often they just inherit old stories without really being digested in a Buddhist form. But this is quite a Buddhist way of framing it, and so she has that wish, and like the women who express themselves through their dohala, she's defined by her stillness. Right? The classic dohala wish, the woman says, I'm going to lie here and on my couch, and if you don't get what I want, I'm going to die right here. Yeah? Even the crocodile said that. Yeah? So right from that really basic level of storytelling, we have that idea that the woman's stillness and somehow the power is exercising this wish, and everybody's under her command. Even Saka, the king of the gods, is compelled by the power of her wish. Yeah? And that whole thing can only happen because of that. And so in doing that, she is not only creating the conditions for the continuation of the lineage and for the prosperity of the kingdom, but she's also surreptitiously laying the conditions for a reform in the role of women within marriage, right? I mean, the whole problem at the beginning was stated that the worst thing that can happen with a woman is to be jealous of all the other wives in the marriage, right? I mean, obviously there was a lot of unsatisfactoriness about that whole kind of situation, as you might imagine. Now, she's the one, she says, oh, well, I don't mind, we'll get all these other women if we need to have children, but it still didn't work. It turns out you don't need all those other women. It turns out that a relationship based on love and based on commitment and based on virtue is what is really needed for the realm. Right? So she's kind of getting in there, kind of subtly, introducing this idea of a committed monogamous relationship as being the most powerful one. And you can think about the logic of the times, that this was quite a controversial thing. I mean, it was routinely assumed that if there was a couple who were childless, that it was the woman's fault, right? I mean, this was the kind of standard assumption. It wasn't the man's fault. And so for a king to have many wives, exactly like this, right? You had to have many wives, not because I just want to have a big harem or anything. It's because I'm only concerned about the future of the realm, right? And so here it's proposing that challenge to it. So again, that idea that through her stillness and through the power of her desire, she's turning the established order upside down and creating an expansion of consciousness and a reform in society. So this is where we've ended up through this whole story. We started with that mention of King Panada and his sacrificial post in the story of Meteya. We then referred to see what that post looked like and so on in the Buddhaji story. We then realized that it had some connection with the horse sacrifice and the role of, especially the role of the queen in the horse sacrifice, which of course is very, well, morally problematic, right? Again, that idea in mythology, it's not telling us a moral fable necessarily. I mean, morality is expressed through it, but the storytelling motifs themselves are not based on morality. And then we saw how the background of that, explained through the Jātakas stories, is giving us whether or not this is really the story of Buddhaji and so on, I can't say. But it certainly is giving us a context within which we can see that there's a meaning for this story and some kind of association that's connecting all of these different threads. So this is that story of Buddhaji and Mahapanada as found throughout the Buddhist literature. So that's all we have time for this evening. And today we've looked at Jātakas, we've looked at the connections between Jātakas and suttas, we've looked at how ancient mythic ideas are retained and expressed through those things, and we've looked at some of the ways in which these are connected with the evolution and change of morality and human and cultural development. So next week we'll continue this exploration and we'll look more at how these stories came to move towards an expression of Buddhist teachings. So thank you so much for your presence, for your time. I wish we could have time for some more discussion and so on, but it looks like I put too many things in there for the lesson today. So anyway, I'll try to put less things in next week so we can have more discussion. And see you again next Tuesday. Okay. Oh, and also just as it says on the board, with Tupten Chodron will be here next Thursday, and then I'll be here on that Thursday as well. So we're doing that one together. Yep. That'll be just before the Sakadita conference.